Welcome to the abyss of the criminal mind, to the shadows that stretch across the tapestry of history. Today, on Mysteria, we will unearth the files of the case that became California's collective nightmare, the elongated shadow known as the Zodiac killer. A figure who not only took lives but mocked the law, society, and every man and woman who tried to stop him. A shadow that faded away, leaving behind a trail of terror and indecipherable codes. December of 1968, a month that promised to be filled with lights and festivities, would be stained by a lasting darkness in the small and quiet Vallejo, California. The date is December 20th. The place, Lake Herman Road, a lonely stretch of rural road on the outskirts of the city. A popular spot among young people seeking intimacy and calm away from prying eyes. In the frozen darkness of that night, two young people, 17-year-old David Faraday and 16-year-old Betty Lou Jensen, parked David's Rambler in a small gravel turnout just a few meters from a water pumping station. They were two ordinary teenagers, enjoying what would be their first official date, unaware that the tranquility of that place was about to be profaned by unfathomable evil. Around 10:15 at night, the air shattered with the sound of gunshots. A witness, who lived nearby and was walking his dogs, heard what he described as the dry echo of several shots. But at that time and in that place, it was not an entirely unusual sound. No one called the police. It wasn't until about 40 minutes later, at 11:20, that Stella Borges, driving down Lake Herman Road, made a grim discovery. In the light of her headlights, she saw the Rambler. She also saw the two bodies lying near the car. The scene that greeted the first officers from the Solano County Sheriff's Office was raw, brutal, and unsettling. David Faraday was found dead just beside the car. He had received a single gunshot to the head at close range. His position indicated that he had been shot at the moment he was trying to return to the vehicle. Betty Lou Jensen was found about 10 meters away, in the grass, dead from 5 bullet wounds to the back. Betty Lou's injuries suggested that she had desperately tried to escape her attacker. The forensic evidence at the scene was scant but vital. 10.22 caliber shell casings were found, fired from a small caliber rifle, possibly a semi-automatic. Investigators quickly concluded that the young people had been forced out of the car. The absence of signs of robbery or apparent sexual assault made the motive for the crime immediately confusing, pointing to a senseless act of violence. A cold and calculated execution. The social context of the late 60s in California, particularly in the Bay Area, was characterized by a mix of countercultural idealism and, simultaneously, a growing sense of disorder and paranoia. The murders on Lake Herman Road, initially catalogued as an act of youth violence, were soon forgotten by the national press. But they planted a seed of unease in the local community. The initial psychological analysis of this first attack, although rudimentary at that time, would suggest a profile of an aggressor who was not acting out of a traditional passionate or economic motive. The attack was impersonal and quick. Shooting David at close range and then pursuing and shooting at Betty Lou indicated extreme cruelty and a desire to dominate the situation to the total annihilation of the victims. This was not a crime of opportunity or uncontrolled passion. It was the work of someone seeking to exert absolute and deadly power. The decision to use a rifle, a weapon that allows for a greater range and a colder demeanor than a handgun, added a layer of deliberation to the act. In the sheriff's report, the case was treated as an unresolved double homicide, a local tragedy. But what the police and the public did not know was that this double murder was only the prologue. This was the initial act, the proof of concept, if you will, of a predator about to move from the darkness of the lonely road to the bright light of the headlines. Not just seeking victims but seeking an audience. The Zodiac killer had awakened, and young David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen were, Unknowingly. The names that inaugurated the timeline of California's most infamous terror, the forensic detail of the 10.22 caliber shell casings, later identified as coming from the same rifle, was the first tangible thread that the police were able to secure. It was a highly accurate rifle in the hands of a merciless shooter. The fact that Betty Lou ran and was hit by 5 bullets in the back suggests that the attacker remained calm, reloaded, or simply continued shooting with macabre efficiency. It is a chilling image, that of a predator chasing its prey in the darkness, unhurried, perhaps enjoying the terror it inflicted. This emotional control would be a constant in subsequent crimes. A hallmark of the assailant, this first attack was not immediately claimed. The killer remained in the shadows. The hours and days following the discovery of the bodies were filled with an unsettling silence, a tense calm that precedes the storm. Key testimonies, such as that of the witness who heard the gunshots, were compared but did not yield a clear description of the perpetrator or his vehicle. The darkness and remoteness of the location became accomplices to the killer's escape. Investigators were left with the frustrating feeling of chasing a ghost. They did not yet know that the killer was about to take the initiative, abandon anonymity, and force the press and police to play a game on his own terms. The murder of David and Betty Lou was the founding act of the Zodiac killer. It was an act of private terror, but the intention behind it was clearly public. It was the first step of a larger plan. The initial step towards a notoriety that the killer not only desired, but demanded. The tranquility of Vallejo had been violated. The shadow of San Francisco Bay was about to grow much denser. The police were still searching for a teenage murderer, but they would soon discover that they were hunting something much more complex and dangerous. A communicator. A coder. A spectacle of terror in real life. The second phase of his macabre performance would begin in the summer of the following year. The first act on Lake Herman Road had been a rehearsal, a blood test in the dark. 6 months later, in the sweltering summer of 1969, the killer decided it was time to move from local anonymity to mass panic. On July 4th, as the nation celebrated its independence with fireworks, death lurked once again on the quiet roads of Vallejo. The new crime scene was the parking lot of Blue Rock Springs Park. The victims, Darlene Ferrin, 22 years old, and Michael Mageau, 19. Both were sitting in Darlene's car, a Chevrolet Corvair, enjoying the night. It was 12:10 in the morning of July 5th. A car stopped behind theirs, a vehicle that Mageau initially described as a Corvair or a light-colored Ford Mustang. The driver approached the victim's car, a detail that Mageau initially assumed was a mistake or innocent flirting. But the man left, only to return 10 minutes later. This time he stopped his car, turned off the lights, and walked towards the passenger side, shining a powerful flashlight on the couple, blinding them before he began to shoot. The weapon was different from the one used on Lake Herman Road. This time, it was a 9mm Luger pistol. He fired several times at the couple. The violence was sudden and brutal. Michael Mageau suffered gunshot wounds to his neck, chest, and cheek. Darlene Ferrin, in the driver's seat, received multiple hits and collapsed over the steering wheel. The attacker walked away from the car and started to walk, a detail that seemed to confirm that the victims were dead. However, in a turn of extreme cruelty, the killer returned to the vehicle upon hearing Mageau's moans, and fired 2 more shots at each victim, ensuring the job was finished. Mageau would miraculously survive, but Darlene Ferrin was declared dead shortly after arriving at the hospital. The key to this attack, however, was not the geography or the identity of the victims, but what happened next. Barely 40 minutes after the shooting, at 12:40 in the morning, Vallejo Police Chief Jack Stiltz received a phone call at his own home. The voice, calm, modulated, and with no noticeable accent, came from a phone booth near the hospital where Darlene Ferrin was being treated. The voice said, with a disturbing coldness, "I want to report a double murder. If you go to the road about 3 miles east of Vallejo, at Blue Rock Springs Park, you'll find some young people in a car. I shot them with a 9mm Luger. I also killed those kids last year." Goodbye. This call was the killer's first direct communication with the police, the first time he explicitly linked the murders of Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs Park. It was a claim of responsibility, an act of arrogance and domination. The killer not only wanted to kill, but he wanted the world to know it, and for them to understand that the police were dealing with a clever and elusive enemy. Forensic analysis of the scene confirmed the use of the 9mm Luger and, crucially, the identification of the shell casings at the scene, linking the case indubitably to the phone call. But the game was not over. 3 weeks later, at the end of July, the killer made his true public debut. 3 identical letters, handwritten and signed with a symbol resembling a cross with a circle above it, were sent to 3 different newspapers in the San Francisco Bay Area: the Vallejo Times-Herald, the San Francisco Examiner, and the San Francisco Chronicle. The letters, written in a mocking and threatening tone, began with the phrase, "Dear editor, I am the murderer of." In them, the author claimed responsibility for the December and July murders, providing details of the crime scene that only the true killer could know, eliminating any doubt about their authenticity. But the most chilling part of the letters was not the claim, but the ultimatum they contained. Each letter came with a third of a 408 symbol cryptogram, known as the Z408 cryptogram. The killer demanded that the 3 newspapers publish these ciphers on their front pages within 3 days, threatening that if they did not, he would go out on Saturday night to kill more people, acting alone but mercilessly murdering anyone who was alone or unable to defend themselves. The killer was, in effect, dictating the content of the press of the 5th largest city in the United States. The social context of the San Francisco Bay Area in 1969 was plunged into terror. The newspapers, faced with the seriousness of the threat, complied and published the cryptogram. Police and the public suddenly found themselves confronted with a type of unprecedented criminal, a serial killer communicating openly, using symbols and codes as a personal signature. Psychological analysis of this act of communication revealed an urgent need for control and recognition. The killer was elevating his crimes to the level of macabre art, an intellectual challenge. By using a complex code, he demonstrated a superior IQ, or at least the conviction that he had one, and sought to humiliate the authorities who could not solve his riddle. The terror intensified with the very content of the letters. The killer referred to himself with pomposity, using language that blended street threat with grandiosity. Authorities knew they could not ignore him. The fate of the city, or at least the peace of mind of its residents, depended on the ability of a handful of people to crack that code. Fortunately, the Z408 cryptogram was quickly deciphered. Donald and Betty Hardin, a couple from Salina, California, broke the code a few days after its publication. Betty, a housewife, and Donald, a school teacher, worked together and discovered that the cipher was a simple homophonic substitution, where one symbol always represented the same letter. The revealed message was deeply unsettling, but strangely lacking the crucial information that the police expected. The deciphered message read, "I like killing people because it is much more fun than hunting in the wild, because man is the most dangerous animal of all. Killing something gives me the most exciting experience. It is even better than sex. The best part is that when I die, I will be reborn in paradise, and all those I killed will be my slaves. I will not give you my name because you will try to slow down or stop my collection of slaves for my afterlife." The content of the message confirmed the killer's purely sadistic and egotistical motivation. His reason for killing was not revenge or robbery or even direct sexual pleasure, but the thrill of absolute control and the delirious promise of a reward in the afterlife. He was a killer with a dark messianic complex, who saw his victims not as human beings, but as property, slaves for his eternal existence. The cryptogram, therefore, offered no actionable clues. It was a manifesto. It revealed the killer's mental state, megalomania, sadism, and an absolute lack of empathy. Despite the frustration from the lack of revealed identity, the deciphering confirmed 2 things. The killer was real and was relishing in his notoriety. The Zodiac killer had officially been born, a name he had assigned himself in the letters. The shadow of the bay had found a name, and that name would instill fear for decades. The police of Vallejo and San Francisco knew that the correspondence was not over. The macabre game of this egotistical criminal was just beginning. If the previous Zodiac crimes had been exercises in cold, opportunistic violence, the attack in September 1969 marked a terrifying escalation. A transition from a quick ambush to a ritualized act of sadism. The killer sought not only to kill but to instill terror in an intimate, personal, and symbolic way. This chapter of the Zodiac saga unfolded on the tranquil shores of Lake Berryessa in Napa County. On September 27, 20-year-old Cecilia Shepard and 21-year-old Brian Hartnell were on a small rocky peninsula in a secluded cove. They were college students enjoying the serene beauty of the place. Around 4:20 in the afternoon, their tranquility was interrupted by the appearance of a man. The man approached the couple with a pistol in hand. What Hartnell would later describe was not the image of a street killer, but of a deliberately theatrical and terrifying figure. The attacker wore a black fabric hood, resembling a medieval executioner, with cutouts for the eyes and a stitched breastplate, adorned with the now infamous Zodiac symbol, that cross within a circle. The killer was not hiding his identity, he was displaying it. He was assuming the role he had given himself. The attacker came closer and told Hartnell and Shepard that he was an escaped convict who needed their money and car to flee to Mexico. This was a transparent lie, a false narrative to justify his approach. What followed had nothing to do with a robbery. Under the threat of the gun, the killer ordered Cecilia to tie up Brian. Trembling, she attempted to bind his hands with a plastic rope that the man had thrown to them. But the knot was loose. The Zodiac intervened, firmly tying up Brian, then tied Cecilia. The process was slow, methodical, and charged with unbearable psychological tension. This act of tying them up had no practical purpose of containment, but rather ritualistic. It was an exercise of absolute power over the will of his victims. The attacker took his time, speaking in a monotone, emotionless voice, which heightened the couple's terror. Once the victims were immobilized, the facade of the convict crumbled. The Zodiac pulled out a 12-inch hunting knife. It was then that, without a word or outburst, he proceeded to stab Brian Hartnell 6 times in the back. Then he turned to Cecilia Shepard and brutally stabbed her 10 times in the abdomen and chest. This crime was distinguished from the previous ones by its intimate and prolonged nature. It was not a burst of distant gunfire, but an act of close and repetitive stabbing. The forensic analysis of the scene was chilling. The severity of the wounds inflicted on Cecilia, especially the 10 stab wounds, suggests that while the attack was methodical, it also contained an element of contained fury, a need to unleash extreme violence. Brian Hartnell miraculously survived the 6 stab wounds in his back, although he was gravely injured. Cecilia Shepard, however, succumbed to her injuries 2 days later in the hospital. But the ritual did not conclude with the escape. After the attack, the Zodiac did something completely new. He left a message. A permanent signature on the panel of Hartnell's car door, a Volkswagen Karmann Ghia. With a black marker, he awkwardly but legibly handwrote the dates of the 3 attacks: December 20th, 68, July 4th, 69, September 27th, 69. Followed by the phrase for your symbol, the crossed circle. This time there was no letter, but an inscription, an arrogant work of criminal art. The writing, large and ostentatious, demonstrated his intention to ensure that the police would not overlook the connection. It was an inescapable declaration of authorship. 10 minutes after stabbing the couple, the Zodiac made an anonymous call to the Napa County Sheriff's Department from a phone booth located at a car wash in nearby Napa. In a tone that the operator described as calm and low, the Zodiac said, "I want to report a murder. I just killed 2 people with a knife." And then, after a brief pause, he added, "And I was the one who committed the other murders in Vallejo." Then he hung up. This call, made so shortly after the crime, underscores the killer's immense confidence. It was a calculated form of self-reporting, a means to ensure that chaos and panic spread immediately. The police arrived at the car and found the inscription, and tracked down the phone booth, finding fresh fingerprints on the phone receiver. Although these fingerprints were collected, they could never be definitively linked to a known suspect in the police files of the time. The psychological analysis of this third attack is crucial. The use of the hood and uniform symbolizes a fantasy of power, an attempt to dehumanize himself and become the character he had created in his letters. The slowness of the act, the deceptive talk about being a convict, the meticulous tying of the victims, all point to an individual who derived extreme pleasure from psychological manipulation and physical control before the violence. For the Zodiac, the stabbing was more than killing, it was a way of possessing his victims, of being intimately close to them at the moment of their terror and death. Brian Hartnell, despite his terrible experience, was able to provide the most detailed and coherent description of the attacker to date, a white man in his 20s or 30s. About 5 feet 8 inches tall, with a stocky build, possibly around 200 pounds. He was an imposing figure. But the most disturbing characteristic was the coldness of his voice, which made him seem not human, but the embodiment of a malevolent entity. The attack at Berryessa was not only more sadistic, but it was a direct challenge to the law. The Zodiac had acted in the afternoon, not in the darkness of night, and had left his physical mark and a phone trace. He had upped the ante, transforming from a slippery killer to a domestic terrorist operating under a disguise and a symbol. This ritual of the hood and the knife sealed the Zodiac's reputation as a monster who reveled in the liturgy of death. San Francisco Bay and now Napa County wondered in terror when and where the man with the crossed symbol would strike again. The answer would come in just 2 weeks. The audacity of the Zodiac killer grew with each crime, each unanswered letter. If previous attacks had taken place on rural roads and isolated lakes, his next move would bring terror to the urban heart of San Francisco. The Zodiac was about to prove he was capable of operating in the busy concrete jungle, right under the noses of the police. On the night of October 11, 1969, in the Presidio Heights neighborhood, an affluent area of San Francisco, the Zodiac chose his fourth known victim, Paul Stine, a 29-year-old taxi driver who drove cab 809. Stine was picked up near Mason and Geary Street and was asked to take him to the intersection of Washington and Maple Street. It was approximately 9:55 in the evening when the taxi stopped at the corner of the street. At that moment, without warning, the passenger pulled out a gun, probably 9mm, and shot Paul Stine at point-blank range in the head. The shot was fatal and instantaneous. The crime scene was brutal. Stine slumped over the front seat, blood staining the interior of the vehicle. Unlike previous crimes, this murder took place in a densely populated residential area, which, ironically, would become the Zodiac's greatest operational mistake. 3 teenagers in a house overlooking the street were unwitting witnesses to the crime. Alerted by the sound of the gunshot, or perhaps by the sight of a taxi stopped in an unusual spot, they looked out the window and saw a man manipulating Stine's body. The teenagers, initially believing it was a robbery, called the police. They saw the man, described as heavy-set with short hair, picking something up from the front seat or from Stine's body, and then cleaning the inside of the cab with a cloth. Finally, the man headed east, calmly walking toward the Presidio of San Francisco, a large nearby green area. The most chilling detail that the teenagers witnessed was the removal of Stine's wallet, an act that seemed to suggest a robbery, but that the killer turned into something much darker. He took a piece of Paul Stine's bloodied shirt. The police, responding to the distress call, made a crucial mistake that allowed the Zodiac to escape. The San Francisco County Police radio had initially classified the suspect as an adult black male instead of an adult white male. Due to this misidentification, when Officer Donald Fouke and his partner, slowly driving down the street, encountered a white man who generally matched the physical description of a man calmly walking toward the Presidio, they let him pass because they were looking for a black suspect. Officer Fouke described the man as heavy-set with a round face and short hair, leaving the crime scene. The descriptions from the teenagers and Officer Falk, although slightly inconsistent due to darkness and panic, pointed to the same man. The Zodiac had escaped by a margin of seconds and an administrative error in the police dispatch. The forensic significance of Stein's murder lies in the physical evidence left by the killer. The Zodiac not only killed, but also left a partial fingerprint and, crucially, a piece of evidence he would use to communicate. On October 22, a week after the murder, the San Francisco Chronicle received another letter, more chilling and arrogant than the previous ones. This letter, written in his usual style, was the direct claim of the murder of Paul Stein. The most disturbing part was the content. "Here is a piece of the bloodied shirt of the taxi driver I killed on Washington Street on October 11th. Attached to the letter was in fact a blood-stained fragment of Paul Stein's shirt, irrefutable evidence that the police were dealing with the real Zodiac, the man who had been cleaning the cab. The new letter not only boasted of the murder, but also escalated the level of threat. The Zodiac announced that from now on, he would change his pattern of attack. Instead of using guns and knives, he would begin using bombs. He announced his intention to build a bomb that he would place on a school bus and detonate it when it was full of children. The killer wrote, "The bomb is a wonder because the explosion could kill a dozen children." The psychological analysis of this phase of the Zodiac reveals an escalation in megalomania and sadism. He had moved from seeking notoriety to seeking infamy, directly threatening the most vulnerable population, children. This shift to a terrorist threat placed him in a different category than a mere serial killer. He was seeking citywide panic. Additionally, the Zodiac included a new cryptogram in the letter, the Z340. It was much more complex than the previous cipher, with 340 symbols, and designed to be much more difficult to decode. The police found themselves in a race against time. They not only needed to identify a suspect, but also to try to break the code that could contain information about the whereabouts or nature of the supposed bomb. The error in the racial description of the suspect by the police is perhaps the most frustrating moment of the entire case. Officer Falk was inches away from coming face to face with the Zodiac, and the man calmly walking away from the taxi was, with almost total certainty, the killer. This failed encounter would become the last credible visual testimony of the Zodiac. After that night, the killer faded away, returning to his game of letters and threats, but would never again be seen by a reliable eyewitness in the act of committing a crime. Thus, the murder of Paul Stein was not simply another death. It was the turning point. It was the moment when the Zodiac was almost captured, the moment when the police had their best opportunity. And it was the moment when the killer, perhaps scared by his closeness to arrest, changed his modus operandi, retreating further into the shadows to continue his campaign of terror solely through the mail. The hunt for the Zodiac now would not be on the streets, but rather on the pages of newspapers and in the indecipherable ciphers. The Zodiac killer was a predator, but he was Tombian uncommunicador. What set his case apart from other serial murders of the time was his insistence on dictating the terms of his notoriety through letters and, crucially, through coded messages. The panic he instilled in the public and the frustration he generated in the police stemmed not only from his crimes, but from the intellectual challenges he posed to the authorities. The cryptograms were his playground, and to understand the mind behind the monster, we must delve into the structure of those codes. The first and most famous of them was the Z408 cryptogram, which accompanied the 3 letters sent to the Bay Area newspapers in late July of 1969, just 3 weeks after the attack at Blue Rock Springs Park. As we mentioned, the Zodiac demanded that the newspapers publish these 340 symbols, threatening a massacre if they did not. The structure of the Z408 was visually bewildering. It was a mosaic of arcane symbols, altered Greek letters, punctuation marks, and geometric figures that did not correspond to any known military or governmental code. It was a deliberate mix of elements, intended to intimidate and confuse. However, in the world of cryptography, simplicity is often disguised as complexity. Fortunately for the terrified public, and fortunately for the reputation of the press, the cryptogram was deciphered in just 1 week by Donald and Betty Hardin. Their success was due to a thorough analysis of symbol frequency. Substitution cryptograms, even the most complex ones, often betray the underlying language because certain letters, like E or T in English, appear much more frequently. The Hardins discovered that the Z408 used a simple substitution cipher, also known as a homophonic cipher. In this type of cipher, one letter from the original message could be represented by one of several different symbols, making superficial frequency analysis difficult, but not impossible. For example, the killer might have used 3 distinct symbols to represent the letter E. This increased the difficulty while maintaining internal consistency that, once understood, allowed for decoding. The message, as revealed, was not a clue about his identity, but a chilling manifesto. The key phrase driving his psychopathy was his belief in collecting slaves for the afterlife, a justification for murder that revealed a self-centered and delusional belief system. The Zodiac killer was not just a criminal. He was a fanatic of his own evil, an individual who had proclaimed himself the master of his victims' souls. The content of the message was as revealing of the Zodiac's mental state as the signature of the crimes. But the Zodiac's game became exponentially more difficult after the murder of Paul Stine. The letter accompanying the fragment of Stine's shirt included the Z340 cryptogram. This cipher was the Zodiac's response to the Hardin's success. It contained 340 characters and this time was much more sophisticated. The Z340 remained unsolved for 51 years, frustrating the police, the FBI, and the community of amateur and professional cryptographers. The reason for its difficulty was not only its length, but a more complex encryption technique, believed to involve the use of a diagonal or pair substitution pattern. Experts theorized that the Zodiac had used a transposition system in which the letters were encoded following a snake or diagonal pattern instead of straight lines, adding a layer of spatial difficulty to the substitution cipher. This long and frustrating decade of cryptographic silence was only broken in the year 2020 when an international team of decoders, composed of David Oranchik, Sam Blake, and Jarl Van Aken, managed to decipher the Z340. Their success was based on the use of modern cryptanalysis software to test thousands of reading pattern variations. The deciphered message of the Z340 was, again, a delusional manifesto. I hope you have lots of fun trying to catch me. I am not afraid of the gas chamber because it will send me to paradise much sooner, because now I have enough slaves to work for me, where everyone else has nothing. While the message repeated his fantasy of slaves in paradise, confirming his motivation, the importance of the Z340 is more technical than informative. It revealed that the Zodiac had the ability to create a cipher that resisted the best experts for half a century. This suggests a mind with genuine interest and real skill in cryptography, or at least the ability to copy and modify complex cipher techniques he had previously studied. The psychological profile was enriched. He was not just a sadist, but a methodical, patient individual who was smart enough to create an almost perfect puzzle. In addition to the Z408 and the Z340, the Zodiac sent other minor ciphers, including the Z13, which has never been conclusively deciphered. The message of the letters and the codes was consistent, absolute control. The Zodiac not only controlled the lives of his victims, but also controlled the media narrative and the police investigation agenda. By using the codes, he forced authorities to dedicate massive and valuable resources to deciphering messages that ultimately only served to feed his ego and fantasies. The legacy of the cryptograms is the evidence that the Zodiac killer was a criminal acting as a performance artist, usando el miedo como su lienzo y los símbolos como su firma. The mind behind the code was a dangerous mix of primal sadism and intellectual cunning, a combination that made him the most elusive ghost in American criminal history. His game of codes ended, but the enigma of who was behind the hood and the pen still persists. The frustration of law enforcement during the years of the Zodiac's activity was immense. They had the letters, the bullets, the testimony of a survivor, and even partial fingerprints in a telephone booth, but they lacked the fundamental element, a confirmed name. The Zodiac killer became the ghost of the Bay, a threat whose identity was lost in the labyrinth of police bureaucracy and false leads. Over the decades, police and private investigators have shuffled a list of suspects, but 3 names stand out due to the strength or notoriety of the evidence against them. The first and most prominent suspect, during the peak of the investigation, was Arthur Leigh Allen. Allen, a resident of Vallejo, the city where the crimes began, became the main focus of attention for the Vallejo Police Department and the lead investigator from San Francisco, Dave Toschi. Allen had a series of eerie coincidences that made him the perfect candidate for the police. First, his criminal history. Allen had been convicted of child molestation, a crime that fit the profile of a predator with control fantasies. Second, the location. He lived very close to the early crime scenes in Vallejo. Third, the weapons and symbolism. Friends and family of Allen testified that he had expressed interest in the story by Richard Connell, The Most Dangerous Game, where a man hunts other men, a reference that seemed to match the decoded message from Z408. He also owned a Zodiac brand wristwatch. Additionally, a friend of Allen claimed that he had talked to him about a plan to commit murders involving a flashlight and a scoped pistol, a description that matched the attack at Blue Rock Springs Park. Allen was interviewed several times throughout the 70s. His writing, however, could never be matched with that of the Zodiac letters, and crucially, the fingerprints taken at the scene of Stein's taxi and the Napa telephone booth never matched his. The FBI conducted a handwriting analysis of Allen that turned out inconclusive. For many investigators at the time, despite the solid circumstantial evidence, the lack of direct forensic evidence, and the apparent inconsistency of his handwriting kept Allen as a suspect, but a formal charge could never be brought. He died in 1992, and posthumous DNA tests proved negative in relation to the saliva samples found in the Zodiac envelopes. Nevertheless, for many, he remains the strongest suspect. The second suspect who gained notoriety in the 90s was Richard Gaikowski. Gaikowski, a newspaper editor from the Bay Area, was proposed as a suspect in the 90s by various private investigators. The theory around Gaikowski centered on his professional background. He was an editor and writer, which explained the fluency and pompous grammar of the letters. Additionally, he lived in the San Francisco Bay Area at the time of the attacks. Proponents of this theory pointed to a linguistic coincidence. Gaikowski allegedly used the term "by the way" in his writings, a phrase prominently featured in the Zodiac's communications. Furthermore, it was argued that Gaikowski's nickname was Gaik, which supposedly sounded phonetically similar to the distorted voice recorded in one of the Zodiac's phone calls. However, just like with Allen, a direct forensic link could never be established, either through fingerprints or DNA, to implicate Gaikowski. He died in 2004. Finally, the third suspect, who has revived interest in the case in recent years, is Gary Francis Post. In 2021, a self-proclaimed team called the Case Breakers, made up of former police officers and journalists, publicly named Post as the Zodiac, claiming they had found new circumstantial evidence. They argued that Post's full name revealed a hidden encrypted message in the Zodiac letters, and that a scar on Post's forehead matched the composite sketch created from the testimony of taxi driver Michael Mageau. Additionally, they claimed that the partial fingerprints found at Stein's scene were not actually the Zodiac's, but those of a secondary witness, which invalidated previous exclusionary evidence. However, both the FBI and the San Francisco Police Department publicly rejected the Case Breakers' conclusions. It's important to note that this enters the realm of hypothesis. Law enforcement agencies reaffirmed that crucial forensic evidence, including handwriting and DNA, does not point conclusively to Post. He died in 2018, taking with him the possibility of a direct confrontation. The search for the Zodiac has become a study of what happens when a criminal is smart enough or lucky enough not to leave definitive proof. The police had the elements of the puzzle: the voice, the symbols, the partial DNA in the envelopes, that, although degraded, remains a vital element. But the failure to connect this evidence to a single name, especially during the crucial years of the investigation in the 70s, has left the case in a state of limbo. The ghost of the Bay remains uncaught, a persistent shadow in criminal history, demonstrating that sometimes the truth does not hide in the evidence, but in the absence of it. The Zodiac killer committed his most notorious crimes and stopped killing in late 1969. But his campaign of terror continued through the mail for years. His last authenticated communication was sent in 1974. A brief and arrogant note where he complained about the lack of media coverage. After that, silence. The ghost had retreated, leaving behind a legacy of panic, police frustration, and a criminal legend that would define the perception of the modern serial killer. The social impact of the Zodiac in the San Francisco Bay was profound and transformative. Before him, serial killers were often portrayed as aberrant and marginal figures. The Zodiac, however, presented himself as an intellectually superior force, capable of playing with the press and the police. The main social consequence was the erosion of public trust in safety and in the authorities themselves. The police of San Francisco and Vallejo were overwhelmed by false leads, false confessions, and the constant mockery from the killer through the newspapers. The fact that a man could kill at will, in isolated places and in the heart of a large city, and then disappear, instilled paralyzing fear. The bomb threat on the school bus, although it never materialized, terrified parents, forcing school districts to increase security and take seriously the possibility of a homegrown terrorist attack. The Zodiac also altered the relationship between crime, the police, and the media. His letters transformed newspapers from mere informants to unwitting participants in his game. The killer used the press as his personal megaphone, and his ability to generate fear with the mere threat of a letter became a template for future criminals seeking media notoriety. This mail campaign was perhaps his most effective crime, keeping society on edge long after the shooting had ceased. From a journalistic and cultural perspective, the Zodiac became a myth. His unknown identity allowed his figure to be shaped by popular culture, transforming into the archetype of the genius serial killer, the puppeteer always one step ahead. The symbol of the crossed circle became immediately recognizable, synonymous with anonymous terror and impunity. The legend of the Zodiac was perpetuated through literature and film. Robert Graysmith's book, a journalist from the San Francisco Chronicle who became obsessed with the case, and the subsequent film adaptation by David Fincher, cemented the Zodiac in the global popular consciousness. These narratives, although partly fictional and centered on the personal obsession of the investigators, kept the mystery alive, ensuring that each new decade brought with it renewed interest and the emergence of new suspects. The legacy in forensic and criminological investigation is also significant. The Zodiac case is one of the first serial murder cases where the police had access to a substantial amount of DNA, although in degraded form, from the envelopes that the killer licked to seal. Advances in DNA sequencing technologies and forensic genealogy have brought new life to the case. Investigators today continue to review that DNA for family matches that may finally identify the killer, a process that was unimaginable in the 60s. The frustration of the police, especially Detective Dave Toschi, cuya carrera fue marcada por su incapacidad para captar al Zodiac, se convirtió en parte de la leyenda. La constante lucha por descifrar los códigos y la humiliación pública experimentada por las agencias de la ley subrayan la necesidad de una cooperación efectiva entre agencias, algo que faltaba en los primeros días del caso, con jurisdicciones compitiendo en lugar de colaborar. Hoy, el caso del Zodiac Killer sigue oficialmente abierto en varias jurisdicciones. Es un sombrío recordatorio de que algunos misterios criminales simplemente se resisten a la solución. El terror que siempre se ha transformado en fascinación. Why el asesino ha obtenido la inmortalidad en el panteón de crímenes no resueltos. El Zodiac no solo mató gente, sino que también mató la inocencia de una era. Why demostró que el verdadero poder de un criminal puede residir no en el número de víctimas, sino en la sombra psicológica que proyecta sobre la sociedad. La pregunta que resonó a través de la bahía en los 70s. Why que on resuena hoy es simple. ¿Quién era el Zodiac? La respuesta permanece celada en silencio. En códigos indescifrables. Why en los fríos archivos de un caso que se niega a morir. Es un misterio que, quizás, nunca se resolverá. Why esa falta de cierre es, irónicamente, la última victoria del asesino.
If you liked this video, subscribe to the channel, activate the little bell, and give it a like. This way, you will help more people discover the story behind every mystery.
The silence of the Zodiac killer, starting from 1974, did not bring peace to the Bay, only a perpetual uncertainty. His legacy is not only that of the lives he took, but of a fear that refused to dissipate. The ghost of the hood and the symbol still haunts the FBI files and the nightmares of California. But terror never rests, it just moves. From the rural streets and cryptic codes of the West Coast, we will now travel to the metropolitan heart of the East Coast, to a city that boasts of never sleeping, to a killer whose thirst for blood was compared to the darkest mythology. Next week, on Mysteria, we will leave behind the hunt for the intellectual psychopath to delve into the story of the vampire of Brooklyn. We will travel to the dark and humid alleys of New York, where in the 90s, a serial killer terrorized the Hispanic community. His victims were drained of their blood in macabre acts that resembled vampiric rituals. We will explore the case of a man who believed himself to be a creature of the night, an individual who left a trail of terror that led the police to search for a predator that seemed straight out of a Gothic novel. We will see how faith, folklore, and psychiatry intersected in the hunt for this killer, revealing a mind as disturbed as it was bloodthirsty. You won't want to miss the account of how the city of New York faced a monster that walked among them, lurking in the darkness of Brooklyn. The Zodiac case taught us that killers seek notoriety. Now, with the vampire of Brooklyn, we will learn that some seek something older and more atrocious than fame. They seek immortality through horror. Make sure you don't miss this deep dive into the darkness. If mystery draws you in and truth is your only obsession, subscribe to Mysteria, turn on the notification bell, and like this video to support our investigative work. Next week, fear awaits you on the streets of New York.